Today's talk is not an indictment. It is not an attempt to shame, diagnose, or morally dissect those who struggle with obsessive jealousy. Instead, this is a map for those who are suffering inside it, and for those slowly collapsing within relationships shaped by it. Because what we commonly call jealousy has been misunderstood. We say, it's because they love too much. They're just insecure. They're sensitive. But these explanations are not only insufficient, they are misleading. So let us ask a more precise question. Is obsessive jealousy truly an excess of love, or is it the psychological architecture of fear the fear that love will disappear? The structure beneath the symptom. Obsessive jealousy is not simply a marital conflict. It is not merely a behavioral problem. It is the result of a person who has reached adulthood without ever learning how to exist safely, internally, emotionally, relationally. Such a person does not experience relationships as spaces of mutual presence. They experience them as systems that must be controlled in order to prevent collapse. In psychological terms, this is the repetition of attachment, trauma, a reenactment of early relational wounds that were never metabolized. In philosophical terms, this reflects a deeper existential anxiety, the inability to accept impermanence, the refusal to confront the transient nature of all human bonds. And so the individual clings not to the person, but to the illusion of permanence. There is an ancient teaching that expresses this with striking clarity. Attachment born from fear perpetuates suffering. Obsessive jealousy mirrors this structure precisely. The attempt to hold on to another person is not always an expression of love. It can be an attempt to control the inevitability of loss. The questions we avoid. This is why we must ask uncomfortable questions. Why do we feel anxious if we do not verify everything? Why does peace feel more frightening than conflict? Why does the beginning of love often awaken the fear of its end? To understand obsessive jealousy is not to ask, what is wrong with that person? But rather, what kind of relational death has this person already experienced? Because this is not about judgment. It is about uncovering structure. Not blame, but origin. Because suffering cannot end until its roots are seen clearly. The first environment when privacy does not exist. Let us begin with one of the most formative environments. A childhood without psychological boundaries. In such a household, the concept of the individual barely exists. Everything is shared by default. Privacy is not respected, it is questioned. A child grows up hearing, "Why would you hide anything? We're family." Passwords are known. Conversations are monitored. Inner worlds are treated as public property. And so the child learns something subtle but devastating. Privacy equals guilt. Later, when the child writes in a diary and it is read, evaluated, criticized, the lesson deepens. My inner world is not safe. Eventually, the child stops expressing, stops concealing, and ultimately stops forming a private self altogether. This is not transparency. This is erasure. The second environment, the moralization of total disclosure. Now consider another pervasive message. If you have nothing to hide, you should tell everything. At first glance, this appears to promote honesty. In reality, it abolishes the right to silence. It reframes boundaries as betrayal. A child in this environment is constantly interrogated. What did you do today? Why didn't you mention that? What else are you not telling me? Even omission becomes a moral failure. And gradually a belief is installed. Not saying everything is wrong. Silence is disloyalty. The child is no longer learning how to relate. They are learning how to report. And over time, they lose the ability to define where they end and others begin. The adult consequence control misinterpreted as love. From these environments, a predictable relational logic emerges. Control feels like protection. Another person's autonomy feels like danger. Lack of verification feels like imminent collapse. So in adulthood, the same questions repeat. Why didn't you tell me? Are you hiding something? If you're honest, you should share everything. But these are not questions of curiosity. They are attempts to regulate anxiety. Because obsessive jealousy is not an individual defect. It is a result of being taught that control is the only path to safety. The deeper layer, repeated relational ruptures. Yet there is another dimension, more severe, more destabilizing. The experience of repeated relational loss. Not gradual endings, but sudden, unprocessed ruptures. A parent who disappears without explanation. A partner who vanishes without closure. A trusted figure who becomes unrecognizable overnight. These are not ordinary losses. They are psychological equivalents of sudden death. No preparation, no narrative, no mourning. And from these experiences, a set of core beliefs crystallizes. Relationships end without warning. Stability is an illusion. Trust is dangerous. The mind that prepares for catastrophe. So what does such a mind do? It prepares constantly. It scans for signals. It verifies details. It controls variables. Not because it desires domination, but because it is trying to prevent annihilation. Obsessive jealousy, then, is not about the present partner. It is about anticipated future collapse. It is a survival strategy. The philosophical core: fear, attachment, and repetition. At its core, this pattern follows a tragic cycle. Suspicion leads to checking. Checking leads to temporary relief. Relief gives way to deeper anxiety. Anxiety demands stronger control, and control ultimately destroys the very relationship it sought to preserve. This is not love. It is identification. The other person becomes the container of one's existence. Their attention defines one's worth. Their absence threatens one's being. And so the cycle repeats across different people, different contexts, different lives, because the structure has not changed. A more honest question. So when someone asks, "Do you really love me?" there is often a deeper, unspoken question beneath it. Can I exist safely in this world without controlling you? Until that question is answered, not intellectually, but emotionally, the pattern will persist. Obsessive jealousy is not a moral failure. It is not a personality flaw. It is the residue of a psychological history. A history where control replaced safety, where exposure replaced intimacy, and where loss arrived without warning. To understand it is not to excuse harm, but it is the only way to interrupt its repetition. Because healing does not begin with changing behavior. It begins with recognizing the origin of fear. If this perspective has helped you see yourself or someone you love more clearly, consider subscribing, sharing, and continuing this exploration. Because what appears as chaos on the surface often reveals, beneath it, a structure waiting to be understood. If, as we concluded earlier, obsessive jealousy is not rooted in love, but in the fear of losing love, then we must now go deeper. Because fear does not emerge in isolation. It is learned, conditioned, embedded over time within the emotional architecture of a person's earliest relationships. And among the many environments that shape this structure, there is one that is often overlooked, precisely because it does not appear abusive on the surface. It is quiet, subtle, almost invisible, but its impact is profound. The child who was not allowed to feel. Consider the child who grows up with a mother who does not recognize or cannot tolerate the child's emotional world. This mother is not necessarily cruel. She may be well-intentioned, responsible, even devoted, but she lacks one critical capacity: the ability to receive emotion. Often this is because she herself was raised in an environment where emotions were suppressed, minimized, or treated as inconveniences. And so, without realizing it, she repeats the pattern. When the child cries in sadness, the response is not empathy, but correction. That's nothing to cry about. In that moment, something subtle but irreversible occurs. The child's emotional reality is not just ignored. It is invalidated, erased. When the child expresses frustration or injustice, the response becomes moral instruction. You should be more understanding. You need to endure. And slowly a rule is internalized. My feelings are excessive. My emotions are burdensome. They should not be expressed. And when the child feels anger, perhaps the most vital signal of violated boundaries, the reaction is immediate suppression. You shouldn't feel that way. And so the child does not learn how to process emotion. They learn how to silence it. The psychological imprint. From these repeated interactions, 3 foundational beliefs are formed. Love is not safe. Relationships are unstable. Abandonment must always be anticipated. These are not conscious thoughts. They are emotional reflexes encoded beneath awareness. And when this child becomes an adult, these reflexes do not disappear. They relocate. They attach themselves to the person now closest, a romantic partner. And so the thought emerges. Even if things are fine now, one day they may leave. This is the root of what we may call emotional survival-based jealousy. It is not driven by evidence. It is driven by memory, unconscious, unresolved, and persistent. When the mind turns safety into threat, in this structure, something critical happens. Neutral events are no longer perceived as neutral. A delayed message, a change in plans, a quiet evening. Each becomes a potential signal of danger, not because of what is happening externally, but because of what is already activated internally. This is why such individuals often say, I don't know, something just feels off. I feel like you're hiding something. But what they are perceiving is not the partner. It is a projection of an earlier emotional landscape. The same uncertainty they once felt toward a caregiver, whose emotional presence could not be trusted. In certain philosophical traditions, this phenomenon is described as the mind, projecting its own fear outward, mistaking it for reality. What is internal appears external. What is imagined feels real. And thus a person becomes trapped not in a relationship, but in a perception shaped by past instability. The turning point, awareness or repetition. There is a crucial distinction to be made here. Fear itself is not the problem. The inability to recognize fear is. Because when fear is unseen, it seeks expression, and it expresses itself through control, through suspicion, through emotional escalation. But when fear is recognized, when a person can say, this anxiety does not belong to the present moment, something begins to shift. The cycle weakens. The repetition loosens. And for the first time, the possibility of transformation appears. To work with obsessive jealousy, then, is not to fix the partner. It is to confront an internal state that has remained unresolved for years, sometimes decades. It is to bring closure to what was never processed, to end what might be called a psychological in-between state, a space where the past has not ended and the present cannot fully begin. The hidden motive behind suspicion. At this point, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Suspicion is rarely about discovering facts. It is about securing control. A person struggling with obsessive jealousy may say, I just want honesty. I'm asking because there are reasons to doubt. But if we observe closely, a different pattern emerges. Even when answers are given, the questioning continues. Even when explanations are thorough, they are not sufficient. Because the goal is not resolution. It is dominance over uncertainty. The structure of questioning itself reveals this. The conclusion is often predetermined. You're hiding something, aren't you? And no matter how the partner responds, if they deny it, why are you so defensive? If they explain, that sounds rehearsed. If they stay silent, your silence proves it. There is no exit, because this is no longer a conversation. It is an interrogation. Obsessive jealousy as relational addiction. At its most advanced stage, obsessive jealousy begins to resemble addiction, not to a substance, but to emotional reaction, because the individual no longer seeks truth. They seek stimulation. When the partner responds calmly, anxiety increases. But when the partner reacts, becomes defensive, frustrated, emotional, a strange sense of relief appears. Why? Because emotional reaction confirms connection. Now, I know I still matter. And so unconsciously, conflict is provoked. Old accusations are revisited. Tension is manufactured because emotional intensity feels more real than emotional stability. Peace becomes threatening. Silence becomes suspicious. Calm becomes emptiness. The collapse of love into control. At this point, a tragic inversion occurs. The exhaustion of the partner is misinterpreted as devotion. Their withdrawal is seen as loyalty. Their silence is mistaken for love. A partner who no longer argues, who simply complies, avoids, or shuts down, is perceived not as broken, but as committed. See, they endure this because they love me. But in reality, what remains is not love. It is depletion. And yet, the cycle continues because the internal structure has not changed. What we are really dealing with. Obsessive jealousy is not about mistrust of the partner. It is about the inability to trust emotional stability itself. It is a dependency on relational tension to feel alive, an intolerance of peace, a confusion between control and connection. If we fail to understand this, no amount of reassurance will ever be enough. No amount of transparency will ever resolve the doubt. Because the problem is not external, it is structural. Where this leads next. So now we arrive at a deeper and more difficult question. Is obsessive jealousy merely anxiety, or is it something more? A psychological mechanism in which one's internal fear is projected onto another person. In our next exploration, we will examine this mechanism in depth. Projection. Why does your fear appear as someone else's guilt? Why does your internal impulse look like their potential betrayal? Why do your own uncertainties become their supposed actions? Because obsessive jealousy often insists, this is not my issue. Your behavior made me this way. But psychology asks a different question. Is that really true? In the next lecture, we will go deeper, not to assign blame, but to uncover the hidden processes that keep this cycle alive. If today's insight brought clarity, consider subscribing and sharing this series. Because this is not a journey of judgment. It is a process of ending repetition. And in the next part, we will begin to uncover where suspicion truly begins.